Picture this. You spend 30 years working on something massive, something that changes the world forever. You solve the hardest part of the puzzle, the part that makes everything else make sense. And then, when the awards come, when the history books get written, when the Nobel Prize gets handed out, your name just disappears. Your partner takes the credit. The world forgets you existed. That's not fiction. That's exactly what happened to Lise Meitner, the physicist who helped unlock nuclear fission and got written out of her own story. This isn't just about one scientist getting snubbed. This is about how a Jewish woman in the early 1900s fought her way into one of the most exclusive clubs on Earth, nuclear physics, only to watch her life's work get stolen by someone she trusted. It's about how the discovery that led to atomic energy and the atomic bomb came from her mind, but somehow her name never appeared on the Nobel Prize. And it's about how even today, most people have never heard of her, while her male colleague is remembered as a hero. So let's fix that. Let's tell the real story. Lise Meitner was born on November 7, 1878 in Vienna, Austria, into a world that did not want her to exist as a scientist. She was the third of 8 children in a Jewish family with a father who was a lawyer and a mother who believed, at least a little bit, that girls should get an education. That belief was rare for the time, but it still came with limits. When Lise finished school at 14, that was it. That was as far as girls were supposed to go. The doors to university preparation programs were shut tight to women. Society had decided that whatever intellectual fire burned in a girl's mind, it should be put out by age 14 and replaced with lessons on how to run a household and be a good wife. But Lise was not like other kids. From a young age, she was obsessed with math and science. There's this story that she kept a notebook under her pillow at night so she could work out math problems before falling asleep. Imagine being a teenage girl in the 1890s in a world where your brothers get to go to university and you're expected to prepare for marriage, and you're lying in bed working on equations by candlelight because you just can't stop thinking about numbers. That's passion. That's also heartbreak, because she could see the path she wanted, but the world kept telling her it wasn't for her. Her parents, to their credit, didn't crush that passion completely. When Lise begged them to let her keep learning, they agreed to hire a private tutor so she could prepare for the university entrance exam. This was not normal. Most families would have said no. Most families would have told her to accept reality and move on. But Lisa's family gave her a shot, even if it was a long one. For years, she studied with that tutor, cramming in all the knowledge that boys her age were getting in formal schools, trying to catch up to a system that had never been designed with her in mind. In 1901, at 22 years old, Lise passed the university entrance exam. Think about what that means. She taught herself with limited resources the material that others learned in years of formal schooling, and she passed. She was admitted to the University of Vienna, one of only a handful of women allowed to study there. The doors had cracked open just a little, but they were still heavy, and most people wanted to slam them shut again. At university, Lise thrived. She studied physics under Ludwig Boltzmann, one of the giants of theoretical physics at the time, a man whose ideas about atoms and energy were reshaping the field. Boltzmann saw something in her. He didn't treat her like a novelty or a distraction. He treated her like a serious student, and that mattered. Under his guidance, Lise fell in love with atomic theory, the idea that matter itself was made of tiny particles that followed rules we could understand and predict. It was a new frontier, and she wanted to be part of it. In 1905, Lise earned her doctorate in physics. She was only the second woman ever to do so at the University of Vienna. Her dissertation was on heat conduction in materials, a technical topic that doesn't sound exciting until you realize she was measuring and understanding how energy moves through matter at a level most people couldn't even imagine. She was 27 years old, freshly minted with a PhD, and ready to take on the world. But the world was not ready for her. After a brief period teaching and doing research in Vienna, Lise set her sights on Berlin, Germany. In 1907, Berlin was the center of the scientific universe. If you wanted to be at the cutting edge of physics, that's where you went. And Lise wanted to study under Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, a man whose work on energy and light was revolutionizing how we understood reality. So at 27 years old, she packed her things and moved to Berlin, ready to learn from the best. But when she got there, she hit a wall. Women were not allowed to attend Planck's lectures. Let that sink in. She had a doctorate. She had proven herself, and she still wasn't allowed in the room. Planck at least made an exception for her. He saw her credentials, saw her determination, and decided she deserved to be there. But that exception didn't extend to the rest of the university. The Chemistry Institute director, a man named Fission, let her work there, but refused to allow her into any labs where male students were present. His reason? He claimed that having a woman in the lab would somehow make the men's hair catch on fire. Yes, seriously, that was the excuse. So Lise was stuck working in a former woodshop in the basement of the building, a cramped, poorly ventilated space that had been converted into a makeshift lab. She didn't even have access to a bathroom in the building. When she needed to use one, she had to leave, walk across the street to a restaurant, and use theirs. This was the reality for one of the brightest scientific minds of her generation. She was doing groundbreaking work in a basement with no ventilation and no basic facilities, while men with half her talent enjoyed proper labs upstairs. It was in that terrible little woodshop workshop that Lise met Otto Hahn. He was a chemist and she was a physicist, and together they made an incredible team. Chemistry and physics are two sides of the same coin when you're studying atoms. Hahn could run experiments, handle the chemical side of things, break materials apart, and see what happened. Lise could explain why it happened, calculate the energy involved, understand the deeper principles at work. They complemented each other perfectly. Their partnership, which started in 1907, would last for 30 years. But let's be clear about something. This partnership wasn't just based on mutual respect and shared interests. It was also born out of necessity. Lise needed Hahn, because as a woman, she was denied access to the equipment and labs that he could freely use. He had the keys, he had the space, he had the institutional support. She had the ideas and the brilliance, but without him, the system would have locked her out completely. So they worked together, and for a long time, it seemed like a good arrangement. But as we'll see, that dependence would come back to haunt her. For the first 5 years in Berlin, Lise worked without pay, zero salary. She was doing cutting-edge research, publishing papers, making discoveries, and the institution paid her nothing. It wasn't until 1912, 5 years after she arrived, that she finally got a position as a research assistant with a salary. And even then, it was tiny. In 1913, she became the first woman in Germany to be appointed as a scientific associate, which sounds impressive until you realize it was still way below the level of the professorships her male colleagues enjoyed. She was breaking barriers, but each barrier was replaced by another one just a few steps ahead. Then World War I broke out, and Lise's life took another turn. She trained as an X-ray nurse and went to serve on the Austrian front. Think about that. She was a physicist with a doctorate, working at one of the most advanced research institutes in the world, and when the war started, she went to the front lines to help wounded soldiers. She spent part of the war in hospitals using X-ray technology to locate bullets and shrapnel in soldiers' bodies so surgeons could remove them. When the war finally ended, she returned to Berlin and her research. After the war, things started to look up, at least for a while. In 1917, Lise was given her own physics section at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. In 1922, she became an associate professor at the University of Berlin, the first woman in Germany to hold that title. Her work with Hahn kept producing results. They discovered new isotopes, new forms of elements that nobody had seen before. In 1918, they discovered a new element entirely, protactinium. They were nominated for the Nobel Prize in Chemistry multiple times during the 1920s. Lise Meitner was finally getting recognition. She was becoming known. She was earning respect in a field that had tried so hard to keep her out. But in 1933, everything changed. Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. Lise had converted from Judaism to Protestant earlier in her life, but under Nazi racial laws, that didn't matter. She was still considered Jewish, and that made her a target. At first, she had some protection because she was an Austrian citizen, and because her scientific reputation gave her a bit of cover. But as the Nazi regime tightened its grip, as the laws became harsher and the danger grew, even those protections started to crumble. Life in Berlin became a nightmare. Colleagues she had worked with for years stopped speaking to her. Opportunities dried up. The walls closed in.
By 1938, after Germany annexed Austria, Lise lost even her Austrian citizenship. She was 59 years old. She had lived in Berlin for more than 30 years. She had built a career, a life, a network of friends and collaborators, and suddenly, all of it was taken away. She had to flee. Friends helped her escape across the Dutch border in the middle of the night, and when she left, she had 2 small suitcases and 10 marks in her purse. That's all the Nazi regime allowed her to take. Imagine spending 3 decades building a life and then having to run with almost nothing, knowing you might never come back. Lise eventually made it to Sweden, where she was offered a position at the Nobel Institute, but the conditions there were awful. The lab was bad, the equipment was outdated. She had almost no support. After years of working at one of the best institutes in the world, she was suddenly stuck in a place that felt like a step backward. But she kept going. She stayed in touch with Hahn through letters, and they continued to share ideas, even though he was in Nazi Germany and she was in exile. In late 1938, something incredible happened. Hahn and his colleague Fritz Strassmann were running experiments where they bombarded uranium with neutrons and then tried to figure out what happened to the uranium atoms. What they found didn't make sense. The uranium seemed to be splitting into lighter elements, but that shouldn't be possible. Atoms were supposed to be stable. You could chip away at them, you could change them a bit, but the idea that you could actually split a heavy atom into much lighter pieces was unthinkable. Hahn was confused. He didn't know what to make of the results, so he wrote to Lise, asking for her help. Lise was spending Christmas in Sweden with her nephew Otto Frisch, who was also a physicist. When she got Hahn's letter, she and Frisch started working through the problem. They went for a walk in the snow, and during that walk, they figured it out. What Hahn had observed was nuclear fission. The uranium nucleus, when hit by a neutron, was actually splitting apart into smaller pieces, and when it split, it released an enormous amount of energy. Lise and Frisch did the calculations right there, working out how much energy would be released, explaining the physics behind what Hahn had seen in his lab. They realized this was huge. This wasn't just an interesting quirk of uranium, this was a fundamental discovery about how matter and energy worked. This was the key to nuclear power. This was the key to the atomic bomb.
Lise and Frisch quickly wrote up their findings and sent them to the journal Nature. The paper was published in February 1939, and it laid out the theory of nuclear fission. They explained what was happening, why it was happening, and how much energy was involved. Hahn had done the experiment. Lise and Frisch had explained it. Together, they had unlocked one of the biggest discoveries of the 20th century. It was a perfect example of how science works. Experimentalists and theorists working together, each bringing their own skills, building on each other's work. But when it came time to give out the Nobel Prize, something went terribly, horribly wrong. In 1944, the Nobel Committee awarded the prize in chemistry to Otto Hahn alone for the discovery of nuclear fission. Lise Meitner's name was not mentioned. Otto Frisch's name was not mentioned. It was Hahn, and only Hahn, who got the prize. The woman who had provided the theoretical explanation, who had made sense of the experimental results, who had coined the term nuclear fission and calculated the energy release, she was completely left out. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a simple oversight where the committee forgot to include her name. This was deliberate. There were several reasons why it happened, and none of them are good. First, Hahn himself downplayed Lise's role. He started to claim that he had made the discovery on his own. that Lise's contribution was minor, that the real breakthrough was his experiment, not her theory. He even went so far as to write her out of his professional memoirs later in life. The man she had worked with for 30 years, who had written to her for help when he didn't understand his own results, turned around and erased her from the story. Second, Sweden had a complicated relationship with Nazi Germany during the war, and the Nobel Committee may have been influenced by political considerations. Recognizing a Jewish woman who had fled the Nazis might have been seen as too controversial, too risky. Third, and maybe most important, the scientific community was deeply sexist. Women were not supposed to be leaders in science. They were assistants, helpers, supporters. The idea that a woman could be the intellectual force behind a major discovery was hard for many people to accept, even when the evidence was right in front of them. The damage didn't stop with the Nobel Prize. After the war, when the US Army interviewed German scientists about nuclear weapons, they talked to Hahn, but not to Meitner. When Life magazine ran a feature on the people who made the atomic bomb possible, Meitner was nowhere to be found. When textbooks told the story of nuclear fission, it became Hahn's discovery. Lise Meitner, the woman who had explained it all, was turned into a footnote at best, and often she didn't even get that. After the war, Lise continued her research in Sweden and later moved to the United Kingdom to be closer to her nephew Otto. She received some awards and honors later in life. She got the Max Planck Medal, the Enrico Fermi Award, and several honorary doctorates. Eventually, elements were named after both Hahn and Meitner, Hahnium and Meitnerium, but these gestures came decades too late. The Nobel Prize is never awarded posthumously, so there was no way to fix that injustice. The moment had passed. Lise Meitner died on October 27, 1968, just a few days before her 90th birthday. She was buried in Hampshire, England, and her gravestone carries an epitaph chosen by her nephew, Otto Frisch, Lise Meitner, a physicist who never lost her humanity. Those words tell you everything you need to know about her. She could have become bitter. She could have spent her final years publicly attacking Hahn, demanding recognition, fighting for what was rightfully hers. But she didn't. In private letters, she admitted the pain of being left out, but in public, she stayed dignified. She continued to speak fondly of her work with Hahn, even as he minimized her role. And here's the incredible part. When the United States invited her to join the Manhattan Project, the program that built the atomic bomb, she refused. She said, "I will have nothing to do with the bomb." Her discovery was being turned into a weapon, and she wanted no part of it. She had unlocked the secret of nuclear fission, helped humanity understand one of the fundamental forces of nature, and when that knowledge was twisted into something destructive, she walked away. She once said, "You must not blame scientists for the uses to which war technicians has put our discoveries." She believed in science as a force for good, and she wasn't going to compromise that belief, even if it meant refusing a chance to finally get the recognition she deserved. So what do we do with this story? How do we make sense of what happened to Lise Meitner? On one level, it's a story about sexism and anti-Semitism, about how a woman and a Jew in early 20th century Europe faced barriers at every turn and still managed to do world-changing work. On another level, it's a story about how history gets written, about the people who tell the story often decide who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. But on the deepest level, it's a story about integrity. Lise Meitner could have compromised. She could have stayed quiet when she was denied access to labs. She could have accepted her role as Hahn's assistant and never pushed for more. She could have let bitterness consume her when the Nobel Prize went to someone else. She could have built the atomic bomb and used that to demand credit. But she didn't do any of those things. She kept working. She kept believing in science. She kept her humanity intact. And in doing so, she became something more than just a great scientist. She became a symbol of what it means to pursue truth even when the world refuses to see you. Today, historians of science have worked hard to restore Lise Meitner to her rightful place in the story of nuclear physics. If you read modern accounts of nuclear fission, you'll see her name. If you study the history of the atomic age, you'll learn about her contributions. But the damage can't be fully undone. The Nobel Prize is still only Hahn's. The popular narrative is slow to change. For most people, if they've heard of nuclear fission at all, they think of it as something men discovered, another example of male genius changing the world. But we know better now. We know that Lise Meitner was not just Otto Hahn's assistant.
She was not a helper or a sidekick. She was a brilliant physicist in her own right, who made sense of experimental results that nobody else could explain. She was the one who understood what was happening when uranium atoms split. She was the one who calculated the energy release. She was the one who gave us the language and the framework to understand nuclear fission. Without her, Hahn's experiments would have been a mystery, a strange set of results that didn't fit any known theory.
Splitting of the atom was one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century. It changed warfare. It changed energy production. It changed how we understand matter itself. But the splitting of credit along gender lines, that was an old story, one that had been playing out for centuries. Women have always been in science. They've always been making discoveries, solving problems, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. But too often their contributions get attributed to men, or they get written out of history entirely, or they get remembered as assistants rather than leaders. We're still dealing with this today. Women in STEM fields still face bias. They still get interrupted in meetings. They still see their ideas ignored until a man repeats them. They still get paid less and promoted less. The barriers Lise Meitner faced were more extreme, more explicit, but the underlying problem hasn't disappeared. It's just changed shape. That's why her story matters. Not just because it's a tale of injustice, though it is. Not just because it's a reminder of how far we've come, though that's part of it too. It matters because Lise Meitner shows us what's possible when you refuse to give up. She was told no at every stage of her life. No, you can't study past age 14. No, you can't attend university. No, you can't enter the lecture hall. No, you can't use the LAD. No, you can't get paid. No, you can't have your name on the Nobel Prize. And at every stage, she found a way forward. She studied at night. She took the entrance exam. She convinced Planck to let her in. She worked in the basement. She published papers. She kept doing science. And in the end, the truth came out. Not quickly, not easily, but it came out. Today, when we talk about nuclear fission, we talk about Lise Meitner. We teach students her name. We name elements after her. We celebrate Ada Lovelace Day and honor women in science, and Lise Meitner is one of the names that gets mentioned. The Nobel Committee may have failed her, but history is slowly correcting the record. If you're watching this video for a school project, or because you're interested in science, or because you care about women's history, here's what I want you to take away. When you hear about a great discovery, ask who made it. Not just the name on the prize, but everyone who contributed. Ask whose work got left out. Ask whose names were erased, because chances are there's a Lise Meitner somewhere in the story, someone who did crucial work and didn't get the credit. And if you're someone who's facing barriers right now, if you're told you don't belong in a certain field or that your ideas don't matter, remember Lise Meitner. She worked in a basement. She had no bathroom access. She got paid nothing for 5 years. She was driven out of her country. She watched someone else take credit for her life's work, and she still changed the world. She still split the atom. She still explained nuclear fission. She still kept her humanity. If she could do that, you can push through whatever barriers you're facing. The story of Lise Meitner isn't over. Every time someone learns her name, every time a teacher tells her story, every time a young girl hears about a woman who split the atom and decides that maybe she can be a scientist too, the story continues. Otto Hahn got the Nobel Prize, but Lise Meitner got something better. She got the truth. And in the long run, the truth is what lasts. So the next time you turn on a light powered by nuclear energy, or you read about atomic physics, or you think about the incredible forces locked inside atoms, remember Lise Meitner. Remember the woman who explained it all. Remember the physicist who never lost her humanity. And remember that history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes, if we're willing to look closely enough, we can rewrite it to include the people who deserve to be there all along.
If this story made you angry, if it inspired you, if it made you wonder who else has been erased, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now.
Because if we don't tell these stories, who will? And if we don't remember these women, who else gets forgotten tomorrow?
They can steal credit, they can rewrite papers, they can dominate textbooks, but they can't stop us from finding the truth and sharing it.
That's why you need to subscribe to Women Erased. Let's rewrite history together.